After studying this module, you shall be able to know about juvenile delinquencies and juvenile offences, the factors related to psychology of the juvenile offenders, and the risk factors associated with non-sexual and sexual violence. The issue of human violence is also a major topic within the academic discipline of psychology. As bisexual theorists do, psychologists mainly focus on how individual characteristics may interact with the social environment so as to produce a violent event. However, rather than focusing on the biological basis of crime, psychologists focus on how mental processes impact individual propensities for violence. The youth of today are faced with a variety of problems that put them at risk. These problems include underage drinking and driving, drug abuse, pregnancy, suicide, truancy, gang activity, and prostitution. It is not uncommon to pick up a newspaper on any given day and find an article describing such behaviors. Crime by juveniles is a harsh reality in India. In recent times, juveniles were found to be involved in most heinous of the crimes such as murders and gang rape. It is a disturbing trend and society as a whole is anguished by such a criminal activity by the children. Police involvement in the lives of juvenile has varied considerably throughout the history. The general approach to youthful offenders within the justice system has been largely rehabilitative rather than punitive. Juvenile offenders are believed to be more malleable to behavior change than the adults, given their vulnerable developmental stage. In other words, there is a greater hope that these offenders whose early criminal career is more easily disrupted will become productive members of society. Next, we will study about the juvenile delinquencies and the juvenile offences. What exactly is meant by the term juvenile delinquency? Juvenile delinquency is frequently used to describe the behavior that is a violation of the criminal law, but that is committed by individuals who have not yet become adults. The nature of juvenile offences is varied and can include anything from status offences to murder. Moreover, the public's view of these crimes often contrast with the realities. Overall, there are about 2 million juvenile arrests each year. 1 million are sent to juvenile court. About 5 lakh are admitted to detention centers, and about 10,000 of these juveniles are sent to criminal court for further adjudication, as has been stated by Shoemaker and Wolf in the year 2005. About 61% of juvenile proceedings are delinquency proceedings, 19% of status offences, and 19% for victimization or abuse of children, as stated by Ostrom, Coder and LaFontaine in the year 2001. Research indicates that a distressing number of juvenile offenders are young and that more juvenile cases are being sent to adult courts, as said by Sigmund in 1994. Another significant area of juvenile delinquency is the commission of property crime. Property crimes typically include offences like burglary, theft and arson. About 1/3 of all juvenile arrests are for a property related crime, as has been stated by Goldwyn and Hems in the year 2002. Burglary is often characterized by entering a structure of some kind and unlawfully stealing property of those premises. Theft is defined as the unlawful taking or possession of property and differs from burglary in that the former entails an offender stealing while in or around a property legally. Theft would generally include crimes such as shoplifting, pickpocketing, or purse snatching. Finally, coming on to the cases of arson, it is often considered a property crime but can also be considered a violent crime because of the potential harm to other persons. Arson is the burning of property crime and may be committed for monetary gain or for the sheer enjoyment of the act, such as in case of pyromaniacs. Property crimes have been decreasing over the last 30 years, as has been stated by Puzanchera etc. al. In the year 2012 in their study. Next, we will be studying about the various factors related to psychology of the juvenile offenders. A substantial research base now exists that better identifies some of the causal pathways for juvenile delinquency, as said by Moffat in 1993 and 2006. Typically, the risk factors for juvenile delinquency are derived from several major areas and reflect the developmental nature of juvenile delinquency as compared to the adult antisocial behavior. The individual, the family, school, peers, and the neighborhood all contain risk factors relevant to juvenile delinquency, as said by Redding, Goldstein, and Hilburn in the year 2005. Substance abuse, mental health concerns, general impulsivity, and difficulties in problem solving are important individual risk factors. Many also argue that many of the problems with juvenile delinquency arise from the family context or the family point of view. For example, poor parental attachment, a lack of parental supervision, and harsh or generally ineffective discipline are the most significant familial risk factors. School is also a significant area of concern for juvenile delinquency. Academic difficulty, unrecognized learning disabilities, poor school attendance, and general academic dissatisfaction are all risk factors for juvenile delinquency. Delinquent peers and gang membership are also potential concerns related to the juvenile delinquency. Exposure to violence, drug dealing, and access to firearms are neighborhood risk factors, as stated by Redding etc. all in the year 2005. Cottle etc. all in the year 2001 conducted a meta-analysis examining the most significant risk factors related to juvenile recidivism among the juveniles. What they did was they organized 30 different possible factors into 8 categories, starting with demographic information, offense history, family and social factors, educational factors, intellectual and achievement factors, substance use history, clinical factors, and formal risk assessment. Cottle etc. all in the year 2001 found that the demographic factors such as being male of a minority race and from a low socioeconomic level were all associated with juvenile recidivism. Race was not a significant predictor once the socio-economic status was controlled for in the analysis. This finding is typically across recidivism studies no matter the form of crime or violence predicted. Although race is often associated with higher risk for offending, it appears that the general finding is related to the lower socio-economic status of minority individuals, particularly in the United States, and not to their racial identity. The offense history variables were the biggest predictors of recidivism, including factors such as younger age at first legal contact, younger age of first juvenile commitment, number of prior arrest, number of prior commitments, commitments of more serious crime, and a longer first incarceration. Although offender history, family, and social factors were the most consistent categories of predictors, there were also a number of dynamic predictors that were related to general recidivism. Factors like family instability, association with the delinquent peers, poor use of leisure time, conduct problems, non-severe pathologies, poor achievement scores on standardized tests, and the substance use were all predictive of recidivism and can also be directly targeted for intervention. At least one study has suggested that it may be more appropriate to use the different risk factors for different type of juvenile offenders now. That has been stated by Mulder, Vermont, Brand, Billings and Juan Marley in the year 2012. One factor that has had the mixed success in the presence of pro-social peers. Although delinquent peers have been consistently associated with delinquent behavior, the evidence has not been as clear if a juvenile actually has positive peers surrounding him, as stated by DHHS in the year 2001. Next, we will be studying about the juvenile violence. An aspect of juvenile crime and delinquency that appears to be of significant concern for the general public is juvenile violence. In general, the violent crime rate in the United States is higher than it was 50 years ago, higher than in most industrialized countries, and violence has grown worldwide, as stated by Garabino in 1999, Rutter, Giller and Hagel in 1998. Furthermore, homicide is the leading cause of death among Hispanic and African American adolescent males, as stated by Hoffman and Summers in the year 2001. However, crime rates for violent crimes such as murder, sexual assault and aggravated assault are at their lowest in almost 30 years for juvenile offenders, except for female juvenile offenders. The rate has risen 74% since 1980 for female offenders, that is by Snyder in the year 2000. Next, moving on to the various risk factors for non-sexual violence. In general, there is significant overlap between the risk factors associated with the general antisocial behavior and the violent behavior among juveniles. This finding is partially the result of the criminal diversity of violent juvenile offenders. Juveniles who perpetrate violence tend to commit a variety of crimes and do so frequently, as stated in the studies of Farrington and Lieber in 2000. In fact, it has long been recognized that violent juveniles commit more non-violent crimes than they do violent crimes, as stated by Hamperian, Schuster, Dinitz and Conrad in the year 1978. Individual risk factors for the commission of non-sexual violence include impulsiveness, hyperactivity, poor behavioral control in general, greater risk-taking behavior, attentional problems, reduced intelligence and poor educational performance, as stated by Farrington and Lieber in the year 2000. As with the general delinquent behavior, there are a number of family-related risk factors for juvenile violence. Having a parent who has been convicted of a criminal offense, parental rearing practices that include low attachment, harsh discipline and poor supervision, child abuse, low socioeconomic status and family conflict are all the risk factors for juvenile violence with parental criminal behavior. Inappropriate parenting practices and low socioeconomic status as the strongest predictors, as stated by Lipsey and Derson in the year 1998. It is very clear that associating with delinquent or antisocial peers also is a risk factor for juvenile violence and has played a significant role in the spread of juvenile violence. The presence of gangs is also related to a number of neighborhood risk factors for juvenile violence, such as living in an urban area and the availability of drugs and guns, as stated in their studies, that is Farrington and Lieber in the year 2000. In one study, Klingenpil and Hengler in the year 2003 divided violent juvenile offenders into persisters and desisters. Persisters are juvenile offenders that continue committing violent behaviors, and desisters discontinue their violent behavior before they emerge from adolescence. Using these two designations, Klingenpil and Hengler in 2003 found significant distinctions between the types of violent offenders who are likely to continue their violent behavior and those who are not. In general, the violent juveniles who stopped their violent behavior, desisters, engage in fewer violent behaviors during adolescence, committed fewer property crimes, were less aggressive and more positive toward peers, reported experiencing greater emotional support from others, exhibited higher job satisfaction, identified closer relationship with peers, and reported fewer psychological difficulties. These differences appear not only in juveniles who act violently and those who do not, but also between those who continue to be violent and those juveniles who discontinue the violence. Now we will study about the risk factors for sexual violence. About 19% of the forcible rapes are committed by male perpetrators under the age of 19, and about 1/3 of child molesters are juvenile, as stated by Finkenhauer, Omrod and Chaffin in 2009. Thus, the system has recognized that juveniles account for a significant percentage of sexual crimes. Overall, the rate of sexual reoffending appears to vary somewhere between 2% and 14% for juveniles, but this figure depends on the sample and the length of follow-up period, as stated by Witt etc. al. in 2005. In a study examining two different samples of juvenile sex offenders, one group of sex offenders in a specialized intensive treatment program for sex offenders and sexual offenders from a less intense program of the general offenders were compared 10 years after release. Both groups were more likely to be rearrested for a non-sexual offense, that is 31% for the specialized treatment group and 47% for those from the general offender population than a sexual offense, that is less than 5%. Furthermore, these offenders from the specialized sexual offender treatment program took longer to reoffend for all offense types compared to the group of juvenile sexual offenders from the general offender program. Waite etc. al. in the year 2005 also found that impulsive or antisocial behaviors were significantly related to reoffending. Hilburn etc. al. in the year 2005 conducted a preliminary study on the available studies examining the juvenile sex offenders and the risk factors related to reoffending. They discovered 4 significant risk factors for reoffending among the juvenile sex offenders. Being an acquaintance of the victim was the most significant predictor of reoffense, followed by not receiving any form of treatment, a less severe initial offense, and being a young offender. Juvenile sex offenders who victimized acquaintances rather than the strangers or friends were more likely to reoffend. Juveniles who had received treatment were less likely to reoffend. One potentially counterintuitive result was that the juvenile sex offenders who committed less severe initial offences were more likely to reoffend, possibly suggesting a tendency to escalate the severity of their offence history. The younger the offender, the more likely he or she was able to reoffend. One question remains though, do these offenders really differ from counterparts who perpetrate non-sexual violence? One study that focused on the juvenile sex offenders compared 122 male and 61 female juvenile sexual offenders by Vandiver and Teske in 2006. Female offenders were younger at the time of arrest, had younger victims, and were likely to receive shorter sentences as compared to the male offenders, and were perpetrated on girls and boys proportionately. Male juvenile sex offenders were more likely to victimize girls. These early results may suggest that female juvenile sex offenders are not identical to their male counterparts and may have different risk factors for initially offending or re-offending. Next, we will study about the competency evaluations pertaining to juvenile offenders. The competency of a juvenile was rarely an issue in the juvenile courts when rehabilitation was the focus, but as there has been recognition of the court's more punitive stance, the forensic psychologists have been called upon increasingly to perform the competency evaluation or the competency test. Issues related to competency become especially difficult to determine in regard to juveniles because of their immaturity and underdeveloped cognitive abilities and the disposition of a case where incompetence is due to developmental issues. However, most competency statutes do not include developmental or psychosocial immaturity as an important issue. The idea of developmental immaturity is important because in adult criminal cases, the defendant would be held for restoration of competency, but with a juvenile that may mean waiting for them to grow and mature into the adulthood. As a result of the lack of legal criteria and uncertainty, there continues to be a discussion about whether competency should even be raised as an issue for juveniles or not, as stated by Demring in 2000. Now students, let us summarize this module. Crime by juveniles is a harsh reality in India. In recent times, juveniles were found to be involved in most of the heinous crimes such as murder and gang rape. Juvenile offenders are believed to be more malleable to behavioral change than the adults, giving their vulnerable developmental stage. The nature of juvenile offences is varied and can include anything from status offences to murder. The individual, the family, school, peers, and the neighborhood all contain risk factors relevant to juvenile delinquency. School is also a significant area of concern for juvenile delinquency. The academic difficulty and recognized learning disabilities, poor school attendance, and general academic dissatisfaction are all the risk factors for juvenile delinquency. One factor that has had the mixed success is the presence of prosocial peers. Although the delinquent peers have been consistently associated with delinquent behavior, the evidence has not been as clear if a juvenile actually has positive peers surrounding him or not.